Hello and welcome to the Paintless Studio. Today we're going to talk about pigments. I love pigments, and over on Paintless we have a super exciting rollout that is near and dear to my heart and very close to the origin of why we made Paintless to begin with, the Pigment Notebook, which is based on a project that I've been doing for over 10 years. So today, instead of talking about a brand, we're going to flip the paint tube over and talk about something that all of them have in common. If you want to study color, become a painter, because we have this medium that can explore the little niches of the color universe, little tiny gradations. One of my missions in making the paint list is to help fellow painters to think in pigments. In a paint line, there are colors that I would never use. I have my own ideas about light fastness requirements. Brands have all of this secret stuff that they aren't going to tell you, like additives, stabilizers. They're not even going to tell you how much of the pigment they put in the paint tube. That's where you can get an overall idea of a brand. A brand might be really into having a high pigment load, but every single color within that brand is up for analysis, we'll say. Even my excitement about a brand should not be taken as like a blanket recommendation, because there's a whole lot going on under the hood with every brand that they're not telling us. The one thing that artists have fought long and hard to know are the pigments that are in the paint, and every good brand is going to tell you that. That is something that I believe that artists deserve to know. One of the ways that you can level up your painting practice is to learn about pigments. If you turn over a tube of paint, on the back, you'll see a little code that has the letter P followed by an abbreviation for a color, something like PB35. What that's going to tell you is how to kind of find information about what this pigment is in a pigment directory. Over on the paint list, you can type in the pigment code or look up one of its common names in the Pigment Notebook to find out more information. Also, this was not something that they taught in art school. I painted some paintings there that when I brought them back to Colorado, which I live at high altitude, we have very bright, very acerbic sunlight, they began to bleach out pretty quickly. These are pigments that were in paints that I had purchased from very prestigious brands. That was what really catalyzed this understanding that the pigment that you're painting with, you cannot rely on the brand name. The pigment is going to give you super valuable information about the light fastness, the toxicity. It's going to tell you a lot about how that color is going to behave in color mixing. With some pigments, there's actually like a couple different varieties. Those are really easy to learn, and you'll get a sense of the color range for that color. You'll also understand things like, does this tend to be super high chroma? Is it very transparent naturally? So for example, PB15, very transparent. PB35, that's kind of going to be more like semi-opaque. It's really helpful to know. PB15 is going to mix really high chroma tints. A tiny dot goes a long way. PB35 is a really gentle, chilled out mixer that is going to make really beautiful, naturalistic kind of colors that are more of that middle chroma. A person can make certain generalizations based on the pigment code and inferences about the general light fastness. There's a few pigments that will require you to do your own light fastness testing just because they're known to kind of vary a lot depending on the supplier, but this will give you really important information. For example, if you're going to be using two different reds and they look kind of similar, it might make a huge difference to the archival quality of your artwork to use one that is rated highly for light fastness. There are a few things that are more disappointing than spending a lot of time on a painting and having it fade. Another really huge reason is toxicity. So this is a bigger topic than we're going to cover in this video, but there are some pigments which are just known to be really toxic. Depending on, whether or not you have other visitors in your studio, children, pets, other people, depending on the level of studio practice that you are wanting to maintain, understanding the really toxic pigments is crucial. Many important artist paints are toxic. How to handle those as a professional user is really important. If you are a hobbyist, you also need to know how to use those pigments. One of my favorite reasons to learn about pigments is because there are generalizations that you can make about their mixing behavior. So yes, some brands will formulate their pigment a little bit differently. There are a couple of different varieties for some pigments, but there are patterns to how those pigments are going to behave in color mixing. If you understand pigment codes, you will be able to very quickly understand convenience blend. If you've watched my other videos, I'm a big fan of convenience blends if a person understands how to use them and when. But with a convenience blend, the paint maker has blended several different pigments together, and this is really helpful to know the pigment codes because let's just say, for example, that's a green that you really like. Maybe it's that perfect useful green for some landscape. Watch those yellows. Sometimes the yellow pigment that they chose for the convenience blend, maybe they chose it for its look, maybe they chose it because it's inexpensive. If you understand pigment codes, you can understand whether or not that yellow is light fast. And so this doesn't just go for yellows, this goes for all kinds of things, but it's a really helpful tool to understand your pigment codes to deconstruct convenience blends. I started accruing the information in the Pigment Notebook by listening to a lot of really seasoned painters who were talking about different pigments. They were talking about their lifetime of experiences. There are some really great luminaries that were sharing a lot of knowledge, and I began to write those down. I made a page for each pigment, and every time I heard something, either in an old book or maybe in listening to one of these painters, I would write it down in the Pigment Notebook. I also began to supplement this with swatches from historical oil paints. I began to find these pigments in watercolors so that I could actually paint it, like a little dot of it, into the book itself. And this became this repository of things that I have learned since art school. I want to invite you to head over to the paint list where you can now find pages or synopses, really, because it's not the whole page, out of the Pigment Notebook. With pigments, there is sometimes a little bit of conflicting information. That's just part of the lay of the land. I want to encourage you, even when you're using paint list resources, take that in concert with a lot of other resources. There's so much wonderful information yet to be shared. So this is kind of like version 1. We may be editing different things. So this is a constant work in progress that is meant to be taken in concert with all of the other really well-established pigment resources. What I want to encourage you to do is to make a pigment notebook of your own. I personally really enjoy pen and paper just for that visceral quality. This can be digital, this sort of log of travels, and I encourage you to make a log of your own travels. I invite you to write down before you even begin your research, to go through your paint box, to look at the pigments that you already have and that you've been using, and to write down your experiences with them. Make a record of your own personal artistic journey. What are your favorite pigments? What do you like about them? Let us know below in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and happy painting.